BBG cars.
It's okay that you're feeling blue, 'cause I'm here to stay. I know there's a way, 'cause if I'm being true, I must say that I know what you're going through. All the fun.
How y'all doing? All right, so we all know we have a problem with this thing and we have to take the head off, okay? It is now a mechanical issue. The valves are now, what you call that, they're bent. So this head has to come off. So what we're gonna do today is we're gonna take the head off and check to see how bad it is, and after that we're gonna send this head to the machine shop to have it redone, okay? Okay, before you get started, make sure the reference marker on the crankshaft flywheel is set correctly. Make sure the timing tab is in the back of the block, and the items you're going to need is this 8mm bolt here for your crankshaft reference hole. Put it in the hole and make sure it's in the 6 o'clock position. Make sure it's nice and snug. Make sure your timing mark is set at, or actually the 9th tooth in the flywheel reluctor. And after that, you're going to use the timing tab, which I made myself one right here, and you're going to put it in the back of the block. Once it's in the back of the block, you're going to sit there and tighten it. You're going to make sure it's snug, and make sure it's snug against a crankshaft counterweight. And all it needs is to be finger tight to get in there, and once it's in there and snug, it's not going to rotate anymore. And then you're going to be using a wrench to tighten it. And don't tighten too tight, just tighten until it's snug. And then as soon as it's snug, you'll feel it, it'll hit the crankshaft counterweight. Use one of these wrenches in my hand, just tighten it snugly. And as soon as it's done, make sure everything is set correctly. Make sure it's snug, make sure it's tight. Make sure the timing mark reference hole is taken care of and the bolt is in there and it's nice and tight. And after that, we're going to go check the top of the block to make sure the TDC is set. And what you'll need to do is you'll need to get the rod and put it inside of the cylinder number 1. And you're going to need to make a reference hole or a reference marker with the yellow paint as you see here. I have a flat piece of metal that's going to be used on the flat edge of the block or the head. And you just set it up until you see the marker at the edge of the metal bar. Okay, as you see here. As soon as it's at the edge, you know you're at top dead center, you know the reference marker is good. Then check the back of the camshaft to make sure that your slots are in the horizontal position. And to check this, you just need to make sure that it's aligned correctly. So as you can see, the bolt here to keep the crank at top dead center is in place. This is the one that I made myself. And we're at the 9th tooth of the reluctor. Okay, and you need to put this 10mm bolt in here to keep this crank still. So what happened to this car is actually the crank didn't spin, the cam spun, because I got this thing at TDC, and the piston means it's going to be at the top dead center, which is static. So it means that, you know, that piston's always going to be the same. So in relation to this harmonic balancer, it stayed the same. And then I noticed the cams on the top moved. So what we're going to do, we're going to adjust the cams on the top, okay? And I'm going to show you how we're going to do it. Now, some people like to take it off with wrenches, but I don't have a certain wrench on me, so I'm going to use vice grips. Watch this. A lot of you aren't going to be physically strong. I'm very strong for my size, so, and it's already been on this bolt. So now we're going to loosen it. It's very tight, so, but not tight enough for it not to work. So we're just gonna, there, just like that, it's off. These cams are pressure fit, and so is the crankshaft at the bottom, meaning you can move the cams around and the pulley will stay still. And that's what we're gonna do, okay? Now, I'm gonna remove the second one. All right, here's the second one. Now, I didn't loosen this before. I just work out 3 times a week, and I'm sponsored by FNX Fitness anyway. Watch this. There, it's done. You see that? All right, that's it. Now, both the bolts are loose, and we're gonna adjust the cams now. All right, once we get the cams adjusted, then we'll be able to put this thing back in the right timing order, or the timing. These lobes are supposed to be facing inwards, okay? Slightly, both inwards, and then the timing is set. And then we're gonna tighten these two, and then we should be done. All right, as you can see, I have this vice grip here, okay? Some people like to do it the right way, which is to put a wrench here, but I don't have that specific wrench because it's so narrow here. So I decided to go, you know, the Incredible Hulk way and just force my way into it. Okay. As you can see, there is minimal damage to the bolt. See, it's minimal, okay? But it does the job. Now what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna rotate this camshaft until this indentation is lined horizontally on both cams. Okay, we're gonna go this way. We're gonna go this way with both cams to get them lined up with this timing bar. Okay, as you can see, I'm at top dead center, and I marked it, and it's level with that. And we're gonna bring the camshafts into the cam lobes inwards, or straight up, whatever you want to call them, pretty much up on the compression stroke. Okay, so now you're gonna go here to this. It has a letter N, as you can see. This is the hexagon, what they call it. All right, and then when you turn this, the cam is gonna move. Okay, the cam is gonna move. Can you all see the cam moving? But the pulley doesn't move. Okay, so once we moved it, you can see down here the indentation. See it? First it's straight up, and now it's level. All right, so that's where we want it to be, right there. Okay, lobes facing up or inward, whatever you want to call it. Then you go to the next one. Okay, the exhaust cams. Now you want to move this also that way. Okay, and you'll see it here. Oopsie daisy. A little bit more. Just watch over here. It's getting tight, so we're gonna have to loosen this bolt a little bit. There we go. Loosen that sucker. All right, watch that indentation. Okay, did you see that? Okay, it automatically popped. Now you can put your timing tab in there, and it should slide right in. You see that? Except this side, I have to adjust that a little bit more. Okay, there you go. It goes in here, and it goes in there. Okay, that's it. And the cams are aligned properly. Okay, so now we're gonna tighten it down. All right, and a view from the rear, you can see how the lobes are. Okay, so this one's slightly off. We can always move that a little bit more, like that's the correct way. All right, now she's ready to be tightened. Can you all see that? A better view. Okay, top dead center, compression stroke. And let's go look at the crank. Crank has a 8mm inside the hole for the crank. All right, this is at the number 9 pin. Okay, on the reluctor plate. Okay, number 9 pin on the reluctor plate. I suggest you mark this before you start this whole process. Okay, and we also have the bolt here to keep the crankshaft from moving. I'm sorry, this one, yeah, to keep the crankshaft from moving. All right, this is a tool that I made myself because I make my own tools. I just don't have the luxury of buying them off Amazon and having them here in one day like you guys, you know, in the US of A. I'm currently abroad, so I have to make my own tools most of the time, which is not a problem. I got enough equipment here, I can do that. All right, so now we're gonna go tighten up the camshafts and this thing will be ready to start. When I first tried to set the timing on the camshaft, I realized the camshaft bolts were kind of loose, so I tightened them, as you can see here. And I used a pair of vice grips. I put them on the hexagonal part of the camshaft, as you see where I have it tightened. And I used another pair of vice grips to remove the bolt, or actually tighten the bolt because the bolt was loose. They were so loose, I easily removed them, so that's why I tightened it, as you see here. The problem with this is, I didn't realize the camshaft had already moved to the point where the valves had collided with the piston. And this is the time that I figured that out. So what I did here is I put the vice grip on both the intake and the exhaust cam hexagonal part of the camshaft. And after it was tightened, I realized that the engine still did not have compression. Even after I tested the compression and started it again, it still would not produce compression and it still would not start up. So what I did after this is I realized this situation and I could not get a wrench on the back end of the timing chain, the timing gear, to tighten it. So I had to use vice grips. And so this is the time that I realized that I had to take the head off, or I needed to take the head off to access the timing bolts correctly. So I had to take the head off after I realized the situation was not gonna work. Before I took the head off, I wanted to set all the reference points correctly, as you can see here with the cam lobes. They need to be facing inwards, as you see here, both intake and exhaust cam lobes. I put the TDC rod into the number 1 cylinder, of course, with a yellow marker, as you can see here. And the flat edge is close to the marker, as you can see here, and it needs to be right on top. It cannot be higher or it cannot be lower. This is a correct marker for top dead center. After setting that up, making sure it's okay, proceed to go to the rear of the camshafts to make sure everything is correct there. The slot should be horizontal. As you can see here, it's very easy to put the flat bar into the back of the slots. If it won't go in, or if it's hard to go in, then you need to rotate the camshaft a little bit more to make sure they go in to set the timing. And as you can see here, everything is squared away. So the next procedure is setting up the camshafts to make sure that they don't rotate, and you make sure that they're stationary, and that's what I use the vice grips for. Down here in the crankshaft area, you need to also double check that the 8mm bolt is in the 6 o'clock position in the hole that's provided here, and make sure the 9th tooth is marked and it's right in the middle of the right in the middle of the pickup coil. And you also need to make sure that the crankshaft bolt, or actually the bolt that keeps the crankshaft from moving when you're at top dead center, is in the right position. And then you're set and you're ready to go, and we'll proceed to the next procedure. Now it's time to set the air gap in the reluctor and pickup coil, the reluctor wheel and the pickup coil. You need to loosen up the 8mm bolts right here, as you see, and adjust it up or down to center the reluctor wheel to the pickup coil. As soon as it's centered, you tighten it down and make sure that it's snug when you're done. But before we do that, we're going to use a feeler gauge to adjust the air gap of the reluctor wheel to the pickup coil. And once everything is set, then you need to torque everything down and tighten it, and at that point it should be ready to go. In the next procedure, we're going to be using a feeler gauge to set the air gap to make sure everything is correct. Make sure everything is good. Make sure the 6 o'clock position is set over here with the screw in a 6 o'clock. Make sure the 6 o'clock position is set with a small 8mm screw in the crankshaft hole. Okay, it's now time to set the air gap on the reluctor wheel and the pickup coil. What you're going to use a feeler gauge that has the brass feeler gauges. Why? Because the brass does not attract magnetism. It's demagnetized. It's made of brass. The steel ones cannot be used because it won't work. You're going to set your feeler gauge for 22 thousandths of an inch total, So that's going to be 16 thousandths plus 8 thousandths combined, as you see here, and slip it in the air gap to make sure that the air gap is correct. If it's not correct, then you'll need to readjust it, as this one is already done. You need to adjust it by loosening these bolts here, the 8mm, and setting up the adjustment. And once it's loose, you need to insert the feeler gauge in the in between the reluctor wheel and the pickup coil. And once the gap is set, you'll need to tighten the bolts to make sure everything is good and tight, and then you're set there for the air gap. Also, you need to double check your crankshaft bolt in the back here, and this is the one that keeps the counterweight from hitting or keeps your timing from getting out of whack when you're turning the crankshaft. You need to make sure it's set, and before you start your engine, you need to remove the one that we're using here after it's set, and you're going to replace it with a stock factory one, which I'm going to show you here. The factory one is much smaller, so that way it'll clear the crankshaft counter rate as it's spinning. Okay, so this is assuming the engine is going to be ready to start, so that way it doesn't hit the tool that we have in there previously, because you don't want to do that. So once you have this original one in, you need to tighten it down and make sure it's very tight, because oil does come out of this area and it will get all over the ground, as it did to me earlier. Once this is set, the engine should be ready to start once we have the head back on after removing the head. So right now we're going to proceed to remove the head and get everything set up for machine work. But you have to prepare this timing the way I have here correctly, so that next time you come back around to put the head back on and reinstall everything, you don't have the timing tab tool in there colliding with the crankshaft counterweight, causing issues. So this is why we have to do this, and we have to make sure everything is set at the bottom and the timing is set and everything is squared away. So once this is done, you make sure the bolt is tightened real good here, the timing tab bolt, so that oil doesn't come out. You make sure your reluctor you make sure your pickup coil bolt is also tight, and make sure the air gap is squared away. Make sure the 9th tooth of your reluctor wheel is exactly in the center of the pickup coil. This is the proper way to do it, and this is the proper procedure before you start this engine. But we're not going to start this engine. We have to remove the head. Make sure all your spark plugs are gapped correctly, and make sure everything is good with the spark plugs before you reinstall them. And we're going to put them in one by one as the order they came out of. As soon as the spark plugs go in, we're also going to make sure the gasket is good on the valve cover and make sure it's not missing, and install that without any oil on the lips of the head, so you don't have any leakage the moment the valve cover is installed. And make sure the cam is set with the a piece of metal that I have here in the back of the camshaft, to make sure the cams don't move at the time that you're torquing them down. And all the bolts on the valve cover need to be tightened in a crisscross pattern. As I said before, I already realized that this head could be warped and the valves could be damaged. So what I wanted to do here is I wanted to get everything back together, including the valve cover and all the bolts and all the necessary connections. The reason for this is I wanted to be really sure that this engine would not start, because now I just had tightened the cams, readjusted the cams, and put them in the right order. So this is my testing of the engine before I put it all back together again, and before I started it for the second time now. So I wanted to be sure that the engine had compression, I wanted to be sure the timing was correct, and I wanted to be really sure that the engine did not start, because there's nothing worse than putting an engine back together again when you really didn't need to take it apart and having it not run on you, and then you've already done all the work and you have to do double the amount of work. So this is why I did this. And after this testing, if it doesn't start this time, this is my second time doing this, then I know it's definitely the valves or a mechanical issue in the head. After getting the small 8mm bolts tightened correctly, You need to make sure all the sensors are connected properly. You need to make sure all of the fuel injection lines and fuel injectors are connected properly. You also need to make sure that all of the wires and everything is connected properly before you start. Check for leaks and check to make sure the bolts are all tight, and check to make sure the bolts are not loose. And also focus on the exhaust manifolds as well. Make sure everything is tight there. Make sure the gaskets are right. Make sure the heat shield is not mounted incorrectly, and make sure everything is mounted in the right way, because if you start this with the exhaust bolts loose, it's going to be very loud and you're probably going to catch a fire somewhere, because the exhaust fumes, or actually the exhaust itself, might be hitting an exposed wire, and you're going to have a big issue when the engine starts. At this stage, it took a lot of time to get all the engine mounting bolts and engine mounts correctly mounted and torqued, because it was really a pain to get it out of there and to get it back in. And it's real close to the exhaust manifold as well. And what you want to do is you want to make sure that all of those bolts are tight, and you want to make sure you get every single one of them, because if you don't, then you're going to have a problem later on with noise, or motor might come loose. It could be any number of factors that is going to affect your drivability, and it's going to cause a hazardous situation for you. So everything has to be tightened, and you have to make sure all of your exhaust bolts are torqued correctly, because it has a tendency to warp if you don't. And when it does warp, no matter how many gaskets you use, no matter how much gasket sealer you use, it's not going to work. It's going to continue to have a leak, and the leak will not go away no matter what you do. So you need to tighten the exhaust bolts, and also in a crisscross pattern, starting with the inside and working your way out. And also to be sure to get the heat shield on correctly, because if it's not, the heat shield protects the engine wiring and everything under the engine from a fire and overheating. And since it's close to the ECU right there in the firewall, it's going to have a major effect on the longevity of the ECU and the wiring if it's not done correctly. Now moving to the other side of the engine, this is the intake area where all the major sensors are located. You have to make sure all of the sensors are connected here. This is where all of them are, or most of them are, near the air cleaner area. You have to make sure all the plugs are going into the proper areas. You have to make sure the air cleaner is intact. You have to make sure there's no leaks into the air intake. And you have to make sure you don't damage anything while you're removing or installing everything as you see here. Just take your time, be careful, don't break any hoses. And if you do break hoses, note the hoses that you broke so you can replace them later before you start the engine. And make sure all of your spark plug wires are set in the right firing order. Make sure every one of them there's no cracks and there's no damage, because if there are, then you have to replace those as well. And working along the intake area, you have to make sure the bolts are all sealed up. Make sure the seals are correct. Make sure the seals are sealing. Make sure the bolts are tight. Make sure all the sensors underneath the intake, there are a lot of them. Make sure the sensors underneath the intake are connected. Make sure everything is good there, and make sure everything is squared away and tightened underneath the intake manifold. Okay, I don't have a video of this, but this is the time when I restarted the engine and tested it. Come to find out, the compression was not correct. There was no compression whatsoever. It was zero, and I knew that. So then I'm going to proceed to take everything apart at this time, and I don't think it's going to work the way it is. So I'm going to start by taking off the coolant hoses, draining the coolant. Then you'll want to drain your oil as well. Then you want to take off everything that you have done before previously, and then the reverse order, and set your timing as well to make sure everything is good before you start working on the crankshaft area, and then proceed to take the head off and remove everything one by one. In the area where the coolant passage goes under the spark plug coil, or the coil of the plug, and there's a coolant hose going under there, you want to take that off. It's really hard to get to. There are a lot of bolts there that mount the coil packs onto the metal or aluminum portion of it. You need to take that off to get to it. As soon as you get that off, the major coolant line is there, and then you want to remove that. As you can see here, the coolant is draining. Once that's removed, then you can work on the coolant line that's also under the intake manifold. They're both connected. Once you get those removed, you can start taking off the major components to get the head off. Okay, after the coolant hoses have been removed, start removing everything in the surrounding areas, wires, sensors, the throttle cable, shifter cable, everything else that's close by. And once all those are removed, the components have to be removed underneath the intake manifold as well, the plastic intake manifold. There are coolant hoses there. There's also sensors there. You have to be careful with that. And once all of those things are removed and ready to go, removal of the head is next. And after we remove the components that are connected to the head, it should be bare and accessible for head removal.